Have you ever noticed something that just doesn't seem to make sense? As Christians, we believe that God is our provider. We believe He created the heavens and the earth. We believe He parted the Red Sea. We believe He fed Israel in the wilderness. We believe He multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish. We believe He raised Jesus Christ from the dead. Those are foundational truths of our faith. And yet, when it's time to make decisions in our own lives or in our own ministries, something changes. Instead of talking about what God can do, we start talking about everything we don't have. Not enough money, not enough volunteers, not enough experience, not enough education, not enough confidence. Maybe you've heard those conversations before. I know I have. I've heard pastors say, we love to start that ministry, but we just don't have the resources. I've heard believers say, I know God is calling me, but I don't think I'm qualified. I've heard churches postpone opportunities because they were waiting for the right time. And if I'm being completely honest, I've caught myself thinking the same way. The more I reflected on those conversations, the more one question in particular stayed with me. Why? Why do people who genuinely believe in God's power so often make decisions based on their own limitations? That question refused to leave me alone. The more I study scripture, the more I realized I wasn't just looking at a leadership problem. I wasn't just looking at a financial problem. I wasn't even looking at a confidence problem. I was looking at a theological problem. Because somewhere along the way, there seems to be a disconnect between what we say we believe about God and the way we actually live. Okay? The observation became the start. That pretty much became the starting point of my research. The title of my study is The Divine Economy, Reframing Theological Imagination and Ministerial Confidence in the Midst of Scarcity. Now, when people hear the word economy, they usually think about money. That's not what I'm talking about here. When I use the phrase divine economy, I'm referring to God's sovereign way of administering His creation, His grace, His provision, and His redemptive purposes. All right, this research is not about a prosperity theology. It's not about promising that faithful Christians will become wealthy. It's not about measuring God's blessings by bank accounts or material possessions. It's about something much, much deeper. It's about the character of God. It's about whether we truly believe that God is sufficient to accomplish His purposes, even when our resources appear insufficient. As I continued studying scripture, something I would say truly remarkable began to emerge or illuminate to me. What I expected to find were like isolated stories about God's provision. And instead, I discovered a pattern. So from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible repeatedly presents a God who provides, a God who sustains, multiplies, restores, and remains faithful, even when human circumstances suggest otherwise. But right alongside that pattern, I noticed another one. Human beings consistently respond to difficult situations by focusing on what they lack. That tension became pretty impossible for me to ignore. And eventually I realized I needed language to describe what I was seeing. So I introduced a phrase that became central to this particular research, which is a scarcity-conditioned imagination. Let me say it again. Scarcity-conditioned imagination. And by that, a way of thinking that interprets life primarily through perceived lack rather than through trust in God's faithful provision, as He's always done. It's important to understand that this doesn't mean believers have stopped believing in God. In fact, that's what makes it so subtle. We can believe all the right doctrines, or we can affirm that God is Jehovah Jireh. We can preach about faith every Sunday and still approach our decisions as though everything ultimately depends on us. If Scripture consistently reveals a God of abundance, why do so many believers continue to live and minister with a mindset of scarcity? To answer that question, I have to go back to the beginning, back to Genesis, because if we're going to understand God's economy, we first have to understand how God introduced himself to humanity. And if we're going to understand the divine economy, we have to begin where the Bible begins. So in Genesis, before sin entered the world, before there was fear, before there was competition, before there was scarcity, there was abundance. Think about it. God didn't create Adam and Eve and then tell them to figure out life on their own. He created the garden first. He filled it with everything they would need. Then he placed humanity in a world that had already been prepared for them. That tells us something about God's character. God's first interaction with humanity was not one of lack. It was one of provision. Okay? But then something changed. Sin entered the world, and with sin came fear. With fear came anxiety, and with anxiety came the belief that maybe there isn't enough. I don't believe the greatest consequence of the fall was simply our physical death, although that was a great consequence. I believe it also changed the way humanity began to see the world. Instead of looking first at God, we began by looking at our circumstances. And that pattern is that pattern that repeats itself throughout Scripture. Take Abraham, for example. God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars. The only problem, Abraham and Sarah were far beyond childbearing age. So from a human perspective, the promise made no sense. Yet God's economy has never been limited by human calculations. And Abraham eventually learned that faith is not trusting what you can see. Faith is trusting the one who made the promise in the first place. Then we come to Israel in the wilderness. Imagine being responsible for feeding an entire nation in the middle of a desert. Now, human logic says, store everything you can, protect what you have, prepare for tomorrow. But God did something fascinating. He sent manna one day at a time. Enough for today, not enough to hoard, not enough to eliminate dependence, enough to teach trust. Every single morning, the Israelites had to decide. So would they trust God's provision again today? So the lesson was about dependence. God wasn't just feeding their bodies, he was reshaping their imagination. Let's examine one of the most remarkable institutions in the Old Testament, the Jubilee. Every 50th year, debts were forgiven, land was returned, economic relationships were reset. At first glance, Jubilee sounds like an economic policy, but it was much more than that. It reminded Israel that nothing ultimately belonged to them. Everything belonged to God. They were never owners. They were what we would call stewards. Then, if we take the example of Jesus, and this is where the pattern becomes quite impossible to ignore. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. The disciples looked at the crowd and immediately focused on what they lacked. They had 5 loaves, 2 fish, but thousands of hungry people. Their math was correct, but their theology was incomplete. Jesus looked at the exact same situation and saw something entirely different. He didn't begin with what was missing. He began with what had already been placed in his hands. Then he thanked the Father, and what seemed insufficient became more than enough. That miracle wasn't just about feeding people. It was about revealing God's economy. The disciples saw scarcity, and Jesus saw his Father's provision. That difference changed everything. Okay? And finally, when it comes to the Apostle Paul, he experienced imprisonment, persecution, hunger, shipwrecks, opposition. And if anyone had a reason to think in terms of scarcity, it would be Paul. Okay? And yet, Paul says, our sufficiency is from God. He didn't say from circumstances, not from possessions. He didn't say from influence, not from his personal ability, but he said our sufficiency is from God. And then in Philippians, Paul says something that has challenged even me personally. He says he learned how to live with abundance and how to live with need. Why? Because his confidence wasn't rooted in changing circumstances. It was rooted in an unchanging Christ. So when I stepped back and looked at all of these stories together, creation, Abraham, the manna, the Jubilee, Jesus feeding the 5,000, and Paul saying that the sufficiency is in God, I realized I wasn't looking at 6 different isolated lessons. I was looking at one consistent theological pattern. God continually proves himself faithful. Human beings continually struggle to trust him. That pattern became one of the strongest foundations for my argument. But I also wanted to know something else. Was I the only one seeing this, or had other theologians noticed this pattern too? So I turned to the scholarship, of course, and what I found was both encouraging and deeply affirming. One of the things that surprised me most during this research was realizing that I wasn't asking a brand new question. Theologians from different backgrounds have been wrestling with many of these same ideas for years. They simply approached them from different directions, and each one helped me understand another piece of the puzzle. For example, we have Catherine Tanner. She writes about what she calls the economy of grace. She argues that God's grace doesn't operate like human economies. Our world teaches competition, performance, earning, scarcity, but God's economy operates differently. Grace is given because of God's character, not because of our performance. When I read her work, I realized she was helping explain why God's economy feels so different from the systems we're used to living in. Then I encountered John Barclay. Barclay focuses on the idea of gift. His argument is that God's grace is given apart from human worthiness. And if you think about that for a moment, most of life teaches us to earn acceptance, earn promotion, earn recognition, earn value. Barclay reminds us that God's greatest gift was never earned. It was given. And that changes everything. Because if God's economy begins with gift, then ministry cannot be sustained by performance alone. Another author was Michael Gorman. He took me a step further. He emphasized participation. His question is, what does it look like to participate in the life of God? That challenged me because ministry isn't about building my kingdom. It's about participating in God's kingdom. Michael Gorman was another good look. And I came across, and his name is a little difficult for me to say, it's Miroslav Volf. Okay? So Volf argues that people who receive God's generosity become generous people themselves. God's blessing, his blessings were never intended to stop with us. They are meant to flow through us. And honestly, I think churches sometimes forget that. We become so focused on preserving what we have that we stop participating in what God is doing. I thank Wolf for that. And Walter Brueggemann, that's how I say it, Brueggemann, may have changed me or challenged me more than anyone else. He talks about what he calls the myth of scarcity. The idea that we never have enough. Never enough time, never enough money, never enough security. The more I read his work, the more I found myself nodding, because I had heard that language before, not just in culture, In churches, in ministry meetings, I've heard it even in my own thinking. Walter just said we just, as humans, we have that myth of scarcity. And then Richard Osmer then helped me connect all the ideas to practical theology. He reminds us that theology isn't just about what we know, it's about how what we believe actually shapes the way we live. That was important for my research because I wasn't interested in proving that God provides. Most Christians already believe that. I wanted to understand why we often fail to live as though we believe that. And that's when everything came together. I realized I needed language for what I had been observing for years, not only in scripture, but in churches, in ministry, in counseling, and honestly in my own life. So I introduced a phrase that became the central contributions of this research, the scarcity-conditioned imagination. Again, scarcity-conditioned imagination. And by this phrase, I mean a way of interpreting life primarily through perceived lack, rather than through trust in God's faithful provision. I'm not saying Christians stop believing in God. I'm not saying they reject scripture. I'm saying it's possible to believe the right doctrines while allowing fear, experience, culture, or uncertainty to shape our imagination more than God's character. And once that happens, everything changes. We start asking, can we afford it? Instead of, is God calling us to it? We ask, am I qualified? Instead of, is God sufficient? We ask, what if we fail? Instead of, what if God is faithful again? That shift may seem small, but I believe it has enormous consequences, because the greatest obstacle to ministry may not be limited resources. It may be limited imagination. And if that's true, then the solution isn't simply raising more money or finding more volunteers or creating better strategies. The solution begins with seeing God differently, seeing ourselves differently, and learning to interpret every circumstance through the faithfulness of God instead of through the limitations that we can see. That brings us to the most important question of all. If this research is true, what difference should it make in the life of the church? Because good theology should never stay on the pages of paper. It should transform the way we live. And as I brought this research together, I realized the divine economy is much more than a theological concept. It is a way of understanding who God is and how his character shapes the lives of his people. If my research is correct, then the implications extend far beyond the pages of this paper. They reach into our churches, they reach into our homes, they reach into our ministries, and they reach into our own hearts. For pastors and ministry leaders, the divine economy challenges us to ask a different question. Instead of asking, do we have enough people? Instead of asking, do we have enough money? Instead of asking, do we have enough influence? Perhaps we should first ask, what is God calling us to do? Because throughout Scripture, God rarely waited until his people had everything they thought they needed before calling them to obedience. He called Abraham before Abraham ever had a son. He called Moses despite his insecurities. He reduced Gideon's army before giving him the victory. He fed thousands with what seemed like an insignificant lunch. Again and again, God demonstrated that his purposes are not limited by human calculations. I also believe this research has implications for individual believers. How many opportunities have we delayed because we felt unqualified? How many acts of obedience have we postponed because we believe we did not have enough? How many prayers have remained unspoken because we quietly assumed the situation was beyond hope? Those are difficult questions, but they're necessary questions because Scripture repeatedly reminds us that God's faithfulness is often revealed in circumstances that appear impossible from a human perspective. I use the phrase scarcity-conditioned imagination to describe the tendency to interpret life primarily through perceived lack rather than through confidence in God's provision. My hope is that this concept provides language for something many believers have experienced but perhaps have never been able to identify. More importantly, I hope it encourages us to evaluate whether our decisions are being shaped by fear or by faith. The purpose of this research has never been to suggest that believers ignore reality. The divine economy does not encourage irresponsibility. It does not deny hardship, and it does not promise material wealth. Instead, it calls us to remember that God's provision is measured by His purposes, not by our preferences. So throughout this project, I found myself returning to one truth over and over again. Are we willing to interpret our circumstances through the lens of His faithfulness rather than our limitations? That, I believe, is the heart of the divine economy. As I conclude, I would simply leave you with the same question that has challenged me throughout this research. When I face uncertainty, when I face ministry decisions, when I face situations that seem beyond my ability, will I interpret those moments through the lens of scarcity? Or will I trust the God whose economy has always been marked by abundance, grace, faithfulness, and sufficiency? I believe that question is not only the conclusion of this research, it is the invitation of Scripture itself. Thank you.